Welcome again. My name is Katherine Nadeau, and I am Catskill Mountainkeeper's Deputy Director. Mountainkeeper is based right in the Catskills, and we advocate to protect the park and region. Right now, we're working hard up in Albany to make sure that we have a lot of funding through the state budget process to support the good work that's happening in the park and all throughout the region. And part of that good work is protecting the park and region from invasive species. So we're joined today by two expert panelists. I'm going to pass it over to John to introduce himself and a bit of his work, and then we'll hand it over to Sarah, and then we'll dive right in.
Hey folks, I'm John Thompson. I am the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership Director at the Catskill Center. Our main office is in Arkville in Delaware County. It's great to be partnering with Mountainkeeper today on this program, and we're going to focus on a couple invasive species, but as everybody is showing in the chat, there's a lot of other invasive species that we're not going to get to today, but we wanted to focus on a couple. Sarah, are you bringing up the slides? Okay, great. So just to give you a little background on the CRISP program, we have a staff that is involved in doing education outreach about invasive species, trying to raise awareness about invasive species so that people won't continue to spread them. While we're also working heavily in early detection and rapid response. Last year, we surveyed over 6,000 acres for invasive species in our region, and we did management on over 50 acres. You can switch slides. Thanks, Sarah. So what is an invasive species? Just so we're all on the same foundation here, New York State defines an invasive species as having two attributes. One is that it's not native to an ecosystem, and the other is that it causes harm to the economy, human health, or the environment. And those are defined in New York State Environmental Conservation Law. And on the right, you can see a couple species we're going to talk about, the Hemlock woolly adelgid in the upper right, snakeheads on the bottom, and Asian longhorn beetle is another one that we've been doing education and outreach about since CRISP started because it's such an impactful invasive species. Next slide. So New York State has recognized, as I mentioned, that invasive species are a threat to a number of our well-being in New York State, elements of our well-being in New York State. And it set up this Partnership for Regional Invasive Species network that covers all of New York State, and CRISP is one of those prisms. And our mission is to promote education, prevention, early detection, and control of invasive species to limit their impact on the ecosystems and economies of the Catskills. And you can see us highlighted in the lower right-hand part of that slide. Next slide. This is zooming in on the CRISP region. You can see the blue line of the Catskills, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. The CRISP region extends far beyond the blue line. The blue line itself is about 700,000 acres. At CRISP, we cover nearly 3.3 million acres. It's all of Delaware, Otsego, and Schoharie counties, most of Greene, Ulster, and Sullivan counties, and a little bit of sliver of Orange County down at the bottom. Next slide, Sarah. So one of the species that we're going to focus on today is Hemlock woolly adelgid. It's a species that on the East Coast, genetically, this Hemlock woolly adelgid that we have originated in Japan. It was first introduced into New York State through infested nursery stock, and we started to see it in the 80s come into New York State, and a little bit later on come into the Catskills region. It's a small insect that has piercing and sucking mouth parts that feed on the twig directly beneath the needles. But when there's enough competitive pressure, you'll see them spread to other parts of the twig. And on the left side of the slide, you can see the cottony masses of Hemlock woolly adelgid, and that's what you're looking for. It's easier to see it usually below the twigs themselves. Next slide. So a little on the biology of this species, it has a little bit of a complicated biology in that there's 2 generations per year. It's only mobile during one stage of its life cycle, which is called the crawler stage. And they lay eggs and they secrete this waxy woolly mass during the fall and spring, and those are those white cottony masses that you see. This slide is showing actually the Adelgid. They have their mouth parts into the twig here, and they're feeding on this hemlock twig. And over time, they can be fatal to hemlocks. Depending on the site, hemlocks could persist longer in moisture areas than it does on like southern slopes, drier areas of habitats. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the hemlock woolly adelgid life cycle is complicated. This is an illustration of that. As I mentioned, there's 2 generations per year. It starts out with an egg over on the left-hand side. Then when it hatches, it's in that crawler stage. And those crawlers can crawl onto anything that brushes through a hemlock, onto birds' legs, and can be transported by birds or cars over long distances. It goes through 3 more stages before it gets to the adult, and the adults lay eggs. Then it again goes into the crawler stage through the 3 instars, and then when it becomes an adult and the second part of its life cycle, there is a flying stage. And I should mention also that this species is parthenogenic. That means that there are only females of the species, so they can all lay eggs. They'll lay up to 300 eggs in the winter life cycle, part of the life cycle. In the summer, it might be 75 eggs. But you can see the populations really build quickly over time. The flying stage we won't really get into. In Japan and its native habitat. It does move to spruce trees. It does have a heterosexual life cycle. They do mate in Japan. Next slide, Sarah. Great. So this again is showing their life cycle of the hemlock woolly adelgid, and it's also pairing it with, down at the bottom of the slide, there are a couple of different biocontrols that have been are being experimented with and are being released in New York State to mitigate the effects of hemlock woolly adelgid and try to control their population. In the fall, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see there's Laricobius beetles. That's when they would be released. They feed on HWA or hemlock woolly adelgid nymphs and adults through the fall. And then in the spring, the New York State Hemlock Initiative is raising, they're called Leucopis or Leucotyrexis, is what the genus is called now, silverflies that are released in the spring. So those also feed on the hemlock woolly adelgid egg. So there's 2 different groups of biocontrol that are being released in New York State. We'll talk a little bit more about those. Next slide, Sarah. So if you see a large amount of hemlock woolly adelgid, these white cottony masses underneath the hemlock twigs, especially as are shown in the right-hand slide of the slide, we have our contact information at the end of this program. You could contact us. It would be great to know where those are. Those are great sites to release the biocontrol, and it'd be great to know about them. Next slide. Hemlock is one of the most abundant trees in New York State. This is a map showing the density of hemlocks through New York. And you can see that they're densest around the margins of the Adirondacks and also along the margins of the Catskills, especially the southeast, eastern, and northeastern part of the Catskills. So hemlock woolly adelgid has been slowly moving up through parts of the range of hemlock, but it's affecting a lot of the hemlocks that we have in New York State. Next slide. And then crisp itself, sorry, this doesn't show up really well. Those little orange dots that you see, those are infestations of hemlock woolly adelgid that we've mapped and crisped through a app that's called IMAP Invasives. It first moved into this region in the late 80s, early 90s, in the southeastern part of our region, and has slowly moved up through the Catskills themselves. And only in the last few years has it been observed in Otsego County in the upper left-hand part of the slide here. So you can see it's less dense there, but we're getting more and more reports over time. Next slide, Sarah. So what can you do about hemlock woolly adelgid? Well, there's a couple different options. One is that you could hire a arborist if you're a private landowner, and you could have them treat specific trees. That works for specific trees or groves of trees. You can use, or they could use a basal bark treatment of the trees. There's also a soil drench treatment that could be used. A licensed applicator could use a combination of two different insecticides. One is dinotefuran, the other is imidacloprid. Dinotefuran is fast acting. Imidacloprid takes a long time to get absorbed in the tree and move up through the tree, but it lasts a long time, so it can be effective over 7 years or more. So that's those are really great treatments that you could use that will kill hemlock woolly adelgid. But on a landscape scale, biocontrol would be the most effective treatment that we can use. And down at the bottom of the slide, you can see there's two species, the Laricobius beetles. Those are the ones that, as I mentioned, the New York Hemlock Initiative is working on. They're also working on the Leucothoraxis. So the Leucothoraxis, they're releasing in the spring for the most part, and the Laricobius in the fall, and they're feeding on the different life stages of the hemlock woolly adelgid. So we have some answers, or working on some answers for hemlock woolly adelgid. It's not a totally dire forecast for the species, and hopefully over time we'll start to see a mitigation of the species. Now I'm going to, I think on the next slide, we'll turn it over to Sarah. Thanks for your time.
You know what, John, I'm wondering, and Sarah, if this is okay with you, would you take some questions on the hemlock woolly adelgid that have come up, and then we can move on to the snakehead? Would that be all right?
Sure.
Awesome. And we'll come back, of course, folks, if you have other questions that you think of later, no rush, we can come back. But we got an interesting question wondering, why are there only female woolly adelgids in the US, but not in Japan? How did that happen? Or what's the story there?
Species of spruce that they breed on, and it's totally different. Like I said, it's complicated, but they need these species of spruce in order to have that part of their life cycle, and they form galls. It's different. It's very interesting species, and I'm always trying to get my mind around parthenogenic species, all female.
Yeah, that is something. Thank you. And then we got a number of questions around the pesticide treatment that you mentioned. Some folks are asking, what if we're treating hemlock trees, isn't that going to impact other native insect species? Or what, if you would speak to that a little bit, or what impacts might exist?
Yeah, so the in order to address that, the basal bark treatment, where you're spraying the pesticides on the bark of the tree, you're being really careful about spraying the trees. All of those chemicals are absorbed into the trees. Those are the best treatment that you would use on a hemlock woolly adelgid, or to counteract hemlock woolly adelgid, and to save your hemlocks. Imidacloprid is a neonicotinoid, so in different types of uses, it could impact pollinators, but and this might be another program, but on hemlocks themselves, and they're not insect pollinated. There's been studies that have been done about how those chemicals move through the soil or get held by the soil. So the basal bark treatment can be done by a licensed applicator. So if you're a private landowner, you could hire somebody to do that.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for explaining that. And thank you for explaining why the treatment is different, because Mountainkeeper and a lot of folks on here I know have been really focused on neonicotinoids, and it can be, it can be a conversation about like, well, where do those get used or don't, and why? And if I may, I mean, one of the things that I've learned from listening to folks like you over the years is that, the hemlocks are such a keystone species, and that when we can use a tool so, in such a finite way, it may be worth considering at times. So
Exactly. Yeah, we're using it in a strategic way, and that's the only effective immediate treatment that you can use.
Got it. And then another question that that's come up here is, how do we know that the biocontrols aren't going to have their own potentially negative impacts? I refer to this as the little old lady who swallowed the fly scenario, and then we have to keep going back. But I'm wondering, if folks are wondering, like, well, how do we know that these aren't going to go out there and have their own problems?
So any biocontrol is tested over a long period of time. It's not in the 1800s, maybe early 1900s. Things would somebody would grab something somewhere, release it somewhere else, and we have laws to protect against that now. But there's rigorous testing that goes on to make sure that these biocontrols are only impacting the species that we think that they're going to impact. They're studied in their home ranges. They're brought to labs here, studied over a long period of time, and then released in the wild. And I didn't point out there's actually bags that some of these biocontrol are put in to look at them over time, see how they're reproducing, and see how they're working over time.
That makes sense. Sarah, would you mind going back? I'm going to ask you to touch on two slides just due to one other question here. Would you go back to the one that John was just referring to? Yeah, there we go. So John, you were talking about those bags there?
Yeah, so those are mesh bags. They're around the twigs where the biocontrol has been released. They're coming back to those, looking at what the impacts are, and the reproduction of these biocontrol over time.
Got it. And then we had one other question, Sarah, if you go forward to the grayish slide map, with the yellow dots. Somebody was just wondering for a little bit more time there. And if John, would you just explain the legend a little bit? We've got bigger yellow dots and smaller ones. And sorry, could you just take a second with that?
Oh, sure. So those are basically looking at, you can think of those as we have more observations within the bigger orange dots, and we have less observations in the smaller orange dots. But each of those big dots is like a bunch of small observations. And I would also add that anyone could download this app and they could start making observations about invasive species. The app allows you to take a photo of those invasive species. That photo gets, the species gets confirmed using that photo by an expert, and anybody, any community scientist could be out there collecting this information. It's really helpful for us to know what species are out there, where they are, and how we can best manage them.
Awesome. Thank you. And then the last one we'll take here, and then we're going to switch over because the snakehead is also really interesting to talk about and has a lot of impacts in our region. Could you just clarify, you were talking about the spruce, and there was a question about the spruce versus the hemlocks. Did I hear you right? The HWA impacts spruce in Japan. Is that what you were saying?
It has part of its life cycle is on the spruce in Japan. Okay. Yeah.
Got it. And have we seen impacts to spruce here?
No. Okay. Yeah. Even though there's some like Japanese spruce beds here, but apparently for whatever reason, not enough for them to go through this other stage of their life cycle. But it's a good question.
Okay, great. Last thing on this map, and then we're going to turn it over to Sarah to talk to us about Snakehead. The blue and the pink squares, John, those represent, can we see those?
I think this, I can't read it well either, but I
You know
think
what?
there's treatments also shown on
Okay,
this map. And so you, as part of the IMAP Invasives um, app, you could track treatments for different species that you're working on.
wonderful. Thank you so much. I didn't mean to put you on the spot on
Oh,
that.
that's
Just if you knew,
okay. Yeah.
and we can of course follow up to, we've got everybody's email here. We can follow up with the slides or with the images as well. And folks can hop on. I just dropped a link in the chat for anybody who wants to check it out. The IMAP Invasives website. And you can go there, learn more about the app itself, how it works. You can download it from any app store. And it's just a really wonderful tool to get information to researchers and scientists who are working on these species and trying to understand where they are, where they aren't, and potentially why. So anybody can help out with this. You can put it right on your phone, so it's always in your pocket. And then you can be contributing to maps like this that show where we've got invasive species. So thank you so much, John. If folks have more HWA questions, feel free to keep dropping them in the chat, but I do want to turn it over to hear more about the snakehead and to meet Sarah Coney. Please introduce yourself and take it away. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Sarah Coney. I am the CRISP Aquatic Invasive Species Manager. I work with primarily aquatic plants, but with fish as well and inverts. And so today I'm going to be wrapping up the webinar talking about Northern Snakehead in the Catskill. There it goes. So the Northern Snakehead is native to parts of Russia, China, and Korea that have similar climates to us, rather temperate areas. And they prefer shallow, slow-moving waters, swampy and wetland areas. And what's really neat about this entire genus is that they are obligate air breathers, which means they need to come to the surface to breathe air. And so this allows them to tolerate fairly stagnant and anoxic water conditions where they're native to. It also allows them to travel short distances over land when conditions are right. So if whatever water body they're currently residing in is unsuitable, they can move by themselves to unconnected water bodies, which is really cool from a biological standpoint, but certainly makes it harder to manage them where they're non-native. And they're also great parents. So they are have incredible reproductive capabilities, and they can spawn up to 5 times a year starting in April, going through August. And studies have shown in their introduced ranges, they actually reach sexual maturity and produce more fry than where they're native to, which is another issue with how incredibly invasive they can be. And so both parents guard the nest, and then they will stay with the fry for up to a month, which is incredible parental care from fish. And so they were originally imported into the US as a food item into wet markets. And up until 2001, Northern Snakehead comprised the greatest volume and weight of all live snakehead species imported into the US. And they were also fairly popular in the aquarium trade. So this is a little rainbow snakehead, Channa blaireae. It's a beautiful little fish, but it's an incredibly diverse genus. So you also have things like Channa micropeltis, the giant snakehead, which you can see how that might be an issue. There's actually been a few releases down in Florida, though it is not considered established, luckily. And so in 2002, the entire Channa genus was banned under the Lacey Act. It was labeled as injurious wildlife, and so you can no longer import live Channa species into the US. Though occasionally you can see dead and frozen fish sold in markets. And so unfortunately, it wasn't, they weren't banned soon enough before they were able to get a foothold in the US. And so the first established population was documented in Crofton Pond in Maryland in 2002. That population was eliminated. However, since then, Northern Snakehead have managed to establish in Delaware, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Arkansas. Everywhere else on this map from USGS, they're not considered established, but there have been single individuals retrieved from California, Massachusetts, Lake Michigan. So there have been multiple releases in North America. And including Northern Snakehead, there have been 4 species introduced into North America: the giant snakehead, the blotched snakehead, and the gold-lined snakehead. The giant luckily has not gained a foothold or finhold. The blotched snakehead is invasive, is established in Hawaii, and the golden line or bullseye snakehead is established in Florida. Northern snakehead is the only one we have to deal with up here in New York, though, luckily. And so they have been introduced a few times in New York itself. The first established population found was in Queens. And that population is actually still there. It's monitored by Region 2 fisheries. It's considered at small risk for spread due to Queens being on an island. And also it's surrounded by a highly saline environment, which snakehead are tough, but they don't really tolerate salt well. And so the next population that was found in New York was in Orange County in 2008. I believe that's a picture of one of the snakehead down there at the bottom right, retrieved from this pond. And so that population was eliminated using the pesticide rotenone in 2008 and 2009. And then we go through about a decade almost before we start seeing more snakehead popping up in New York. This was big news when a few snakehead were caught in the Delaware River near Calhoun and Narrowsburg in 2020. It's not incredibly surprising due to the fact that they have been in the lower Delaware down near New Jersey for quite a while now. And the Delaware is the largest undammed river east of the Mississippi. So it's a big hop, but not completely unexpected. And so in 2021, they made their way into the Bashakill. They were first found in the Bashakill Wildlife Management Area, which is very good habitat for the northern snakehead, unfortunately. And so it begs the question, where next? There's a lot of concern for upstream dispersal in the Susquehanna River due to large populations being found in the Chesapeake Bay. And despite there being many dams on the Susquehanna, they are steadily making their way northward. There's a lot of effort going into track northern snakehead in the Susquehanna. There's also a lot of concern for dispersal into the Hudson from the Delaware due to the Delaware and Hudson Canal. So this is now largely dewatered canal built in the 1820s to transport coal from Pennsylvania into the Hudson River. You can see from the picture, the water's pretty low and a lot of areas are pretty dry in the summer. However, it still holds water along the watershed divide and other locations. And for a fish that can crawl on land, doesn't pose as much of an issue as it might for other species. And so this is a map of the Delaware and Hudson Canal. You can see the main stem of the Delaware over there on the right. And then the canal goes up through Wurtsboro over into Kingston to connect to the Hudson. And that blue circle right there, that is the Bashakill, which is connected to, is directly connected to the canal. And so to prevent their movement into the Hudson, in August of 2022, DEC erected this temporary barrier to help halt their spread. And just in August of this last year, they were able to erect this improved temporary barrier. And DEC will continue to work on further improving the barrier itself and designing and implementing a more permanent barrier that would hydrologically separate the watersheds, since they shouldn't be connected to begin with. And so I'd like to bring up that here in New York, we have a couple of species that somewhat resemble northern snakehead and are commonly mistaken for them, especially the bowfin. Bowfin are stocked into the Bashakill, so there is an overlap there. And we do get reports of people catching them and mistaking them for snakehead. So I'd like to point out a few key differences just in case anybody ever comes across these. So this is the northern snakehead. It lives up to its name. It has a very snake-like head. It's very flat and the eyes are located towards the top on either side. They also have really long dorsal and anal rays or fins and supported entirely by rays. If you look, you can see the top of the dorsal fin. It starts right below the head and continues all the way down to the tail. The anal fin starts about halfway down the body and continues all the way down to the tail. Whereas in our bowfin, they have a very short anal fin, especially compared to the snakehead. And they have a much more rounded head with nasal tubercles that stick out, kind of cute. And they also have a really distinctive spot on the tail fin that is a good giveaway, because snakeheads are stripes and blotchy, but they don't have that distinctive spot on the tail fin. The males also get a beautiful green color when they're spawning, which highly recommend if you haven't seen them before. And this is our native burbot. So unfortunately, these guys are on decline. They are found in the Susquehanna watershed, and they are called freshwater cod. They have a whole bunch of names, and I think they kind of look like catfish, even though they're not related. And so a really good giveaway that you're dealing with a burbot is the single barbel hanging down from the chin, kind of like a reverse unicorn. And if you'll notice, the bowfin and the burbot both have tubercles and a barbel, whereas the snakehead has nothing, no whiskers, no barbels, no tubercles. So if you see some sort of facial feature like that, it's a good hint that it's not a snakehead. The burbot also has a really distinctive split in the dorsal fin. So it has a long dorsal fin and anal fin, just like the snakehead. But there's a really distinctive split in it, unlike in the snakehead. And so a lot of people are asking, what can we do about the snakehead? And with all invasive species, the key is prevention, not moving them around. I've heard from fishermen that the fry and young of year make good bait, which is highly discouraged. Please use New York certified bait, so you're not only not moving around non-native species, but also not potentially introducing pathogens and parasites into new water bodies. They're also the adults are very popular sport fish. So there is some concern for human-mediated transportation into new water bodies. That is illegal to transport snakehead, live snakehead. So if you do ever catch them, you're encouraged to take photos and report them either to DEC, to CRISP, to IMAP, and then don't release them. Take them home with you. Like I said, they were originally imported as a food item. They're supposed to be delicious. So please take them home, cook them up, and let me know how they are, because I have not been able to catch one. But yeah, that is the Northern Snakehead. And I don't know if we have time for more questions.
We do. Yeah, we've got a couple minutes left here. So if you're open to some questions about the snakehead, which is super interesting, and thank you for a great presentation. So one of the questions we have here is, we've heard this attendee has heard that snakehead burrow into riverbanks and can destabilize the bank. Have you heard of burrowing snakehead before, or might that be something else?
So the dojo loach is well known for doing that, and there are a few other species, mostly like catfish and such, but I've never heard snakehead doing that. They tend to overwinter in deeper waters and then spend most of their summer in shallow, but I've never heard of them burrowing.
Got it. And then about you'd mentioned the different water bodies and the Bashakill and the Hudson, and mentioned that, you know, they weren't connected and maybe shouldn't be connected. Could you talk a little bit more about why we wouldn't want to connect one water body with another?
Yeah, so I mean, these are relatively isolated systems that haven't really been connected since the last glaciation or even longer before that. So they've developed kind of their own way. And so an introduction from, even though it might seem like a really short distance for us, that's crossing mountains for these fish and crayfish and whatever else might be transported around. And so they can have some detrimental effects on native species there.
Got it.
The Delaware,
Thank you.
yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
It also serves as a highway. So if we do have the snakehead in the Delaware, they would be somewhat isolated in the Delaware, but because we connected them to the Hudson, now we have to worry about them getting into the Hudson. And then from there into the Mohawk, over into the Great Lakes. And so canals pose a huge threat, a huge problem with aquatic invasive species.
Thank you. And then could you talk a little bit about the barriers that DEC put up? Are there any concerns for migratory species or for any of the native species in the area to be impacted by the barriers?
No. So like I said, these watersheds really shouldn't be connected to begin with. So if anything, it's a better solution all around. Even if other species are moving between the watersheds, it's better to halt that.
Got it. Got it. Got it. And have we seen any snakehead in the reservoirs? Anything aside from the Catskill in our area?
No, DEC has been doing a lot of electrofishing eDNA. eDNA is environmental DNA. You can take a water sample and run it through a lab and it can tell you what's there. It's really cool. And so they've been working on tracking the snakehead, and they really haven't seen much movement outside of the main stem and the Bashakill. I think they would also have trouble getting into some of the reservoirs due to the dams and whatnot.
Okay. All right. Got it. Thank you. And then are the barriers that we're using right now for these fish, are they just physical? This attendee is saying, for carp, sometimes there's electric current used. Are we using current, or are we just using physical barriers?
I think because of how shallow and relatively small the canal is, the physical barrier works pretty well. Over in the Mississippi is a much more, where they're primarily using those, it's a much larger system, lot of fish, a lot more fish. So this is a good question for DEC since they've been putting it up. I don't know anybody from there is on, but it should be a pretty good solution for stopping the snakehead.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions, or excuse me, a couple questions left and a couple minutes left. Can we circle back, John? There were a couple questions left on the Hemlock woolly Adelgid, one about elongate scale and one about genetic editing. Do you want to talk about those?
Yes. Sorry, I was trying to type and answer the questions, but it's not working for me. So elongate hemlock scale is another pest on hemlocks. From what I've seen, like Hemlock woolly Adelgid is susceptible to winter cold temperatures, or if there's changes in winter temperatures, which we're seeing a lot yesterday to today, for instance, that makes them, those are the type of changes where they're susceptible from being killed from experiencing mortality because of cold. When we get polar vortexes, back when we used to have winters, things like that, they can really impact the Hemlock woolly Adelgid population. I haven't seen elongate hemlock scale die back so much as we get sometimes with Hemlock woolly Adelgid, but together both of those pests are affecting hemlocks. Hemlocks, I don't think I mentioned this, but what the hemlocks are trying to do is wall off where they have this pest that's penetrating their bark, and they end up just kind of starving each of the those little twigs from the sap that normally flows through them. So you'll see the hemlocks themselves, the needles will turn orange and drop off, and that's what's actually killing the hemlocks, is the reaction of the hemlocks themselves from these sap-sucking insects. And elongate hemlock scale is another insect that's impacting them. And in terms of genetics, there are some hemlocks. There's a stand in New Jersey called the Bulletproof Stand that as this wave of this invasive species of Hemlock woolly Adelgid kind of spread through New Jersey. There's this patch that seemed to be resistant to Hemlock woolly Adelgid. They're doing a lot of studying of that stand. There may be, and this is a strategy that we're using for emerald ash borers, to find lingering ash trees, individuals that are resistant to some degree to emerald ash borer. If you could collect those in the wild, bring them to the Forest Service where they could combine the genetics of these trees, you could get a tree that was had several strategies against emerald ash borer, or we might be able to do that with Hemlock woolly Adelgid if we find trees that are resistant to Hemlock woolly Adelgid.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. And we've had great questions in from participants. I appreciate that. One thing I just want to leave y'all with before we part here is I know that we at Mountainkeeper, we get a lot of questions about like, well, what can I plant or what should I plant or where do I get, trees and saplings and things, and know that that they are that they're safe and that they're native. So we put together a list. We did an entire webinar I think it was in 2020, all about native plants and native plantings, and we were on with the Mountaintop Arboretum and others. If you want to watch that webinar, you can check it out on our website. And if you just want the list of native species and some additional resources on those, I just dropped that link in the chat. So please feel free to head over to catskillmountainkeeper.org and look for it was Native Wonders was the title for that webinar. And no, it was Wild Wonders. Sorry about that. Was the name of that webinar. And so you can check that out. You can get more lists. We've been recording today. We will share this this recording on the Mountainkeeper website, on our social media channels. We're going to send it over to CRISP so that they can share it on theirs, and with the Catskill Center as well, because Mountainkeeper loves the Catskill Center, loves working with you all. What a tremendous resource we have right in our own region to better understand the science of what's going on the ground, and also what we can do to help, what key questions we have to be considering. So with that, I will just say to everybody, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please wash your boats. Please wipe off your boots. Please use native bait, and please have a really wonderful day. Don't hesitate to drop a note with any questions, and we'll see you on the internet sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Catherine.